for coming out. I know that there's a time investment in anything that we attend these days, and time is precious, so the fact that you chose this place to be right now is a deep honor for me. So the title is more or less the concept behind what I'm going to be talking about today. The idea that in certain cases in the African American historical experience, there were some very radical initiatives that were largely proposed after formerly enslaved people gained their freedom, after the Civil War. For a brief time, African Americans gained some political power through the voting bloc, and they sought to put in place things that had been withheld from them for generations by this point, centuries. Arguably, the most radical of those ideas was manifested in the state of South Carolina, which is not usually thought of in American history as this bastion of liberalism or progressivism to that degree. But for a brief moment, as African American politicians took over the state, and I'll explain how that happened in a minute, they implemented this strategy in which the hundreds of thousands of African Americans and poor white people that had also been left out of the system could obtain an education completely tuition-free. So when we talk about the 19th century, some people usually suggest, well, that's a 19th century idea, as if it's an idea that's old-fashioned, bigoted to some degree. In this case, the 19th century is far more progressive than what we have now in terms of education, as far as opening up the channels to students that are from traditionally underrepresented and marginalized communities. There's reasons why it would ultimately fail, as I'll go over, but I just think it's important to stress that point, that at least for a brief period in the 19th century, you see certain proposals that surpass anything that radicals push forward today. So, one such radical, though I think he kind of distanced himself from that title during his primary campaign, was Bernie Sanders, who I'm imagining that most people my age I would consider on the upper end of the millennial spectrum these days, had probably not heard of until he pushed for his campaign via the Democratic Party, because I don't think he actually identifies as a Democrat. He's an independent that is very much an avowed democratic socialist. He proposed certain things like universal health care, which remains a very popular idea amongst many people my age and younger, it seems. But one thing that really got millennials going, mostly because the vast majority of us seem to be in a lot of debt these days, was this idea of a tuition-free higher education. Mainly the argument being that even if you don't like the idea of expanding higher education to be free for those that qualify to go to college, it certainly is preferable than what's going on now, to where people are overloaded with debt to the point where it's becoming very difficult to actually pay it back. People are not being socially mobile within the entry positions that they're gaining after they graduate. And he suggested that, in fact, this isn't a radical idea. You know, as I'll suggest, the definition of radical perhaps is important to consider here, in that Scandinavian and Northern European countries become the model for what they call free college. Largely, the bills fit by the taxpayers. And there are differing studies as to how efficient this is as a system, how effective it is for the countries. There is some evidence that some of the top countries in the world for an educated population still charge tuition, but at the same time, those that have implemented tuition-free universities and colleges see a significant benefit as more and more people graduate from the university and then start contributing their own money to the society as well. So there's a cycle that goes through here. And it's not that I necessarily had a problem with what Bernie Sanders was saying, but I always feel that African Americans are not fully credited for everything that they've done in the country. And I didn't expect everyone to know about this research, but it's not like it's hidden. I mean, it was suppressed for a long time, but it's there. And so my small intervention, if Bernie Sanders ever sees me on Twitter, is that there is an example of tuition-free universities right in our own history, and it's not just in California. So what is a radical idea? Essentially, it comes down to this notion that it hasn't really been done before, or that it's against tradition. So if we take the latter part of that definition, being against tradition, proposing a tuition-free university would be a radical idea. And the proposal of a tuition-free university in the 19th century, in the period we call Reconstruction, after the Civil War, was also a radical idea. So there's nothing inherently wrong with being radical, it's just a word that's kind of used to suggest it's a scary thing, that people are breaking from conformity and they're going to challenge the institutions that we currently know. So when Sanders says it's not a radical idea, he's half right, but to some degree what we currently have certainly bears no resemblance to the notion of a universally available education. So I have to throw some shout outs to California, because this was the state that implemented in 1868 and had it the longest. Now it would eventually go away by the 1970s. People would start being charged what we call tuition for courses. But according to the 1868 Organic Act, charters of the University of South Carolina, it was stated that at the point that it was available, a tuition-free university or college would be implemented for all residents of the state. And California did fulfill that promise eventually. And it stayed that way throughout much of the 20th century. Now, when people went to the university, they'd be charged fees, miscellaneous things they'd have to pay for. But the concept of charging tuition, which essentially means you're paying for the units of the course, that was not known in public schools in California till after the mid-20th century. So, California in 1868 implements this policy with the promise that it will eventually happen, and it does. But much less well known, and I argue an even more radical initiative, happened on the complete opposite coast, over on the Atlantic side of the United States. Largely through the maneuvers of what some popularly called the Black Parliament of South Carolina. This was a group of individuals, largely elected black officials. In the 1860s elections, the radical Republicans largely took the state offices of the state of South Carolina, many of whom were black. In fact, 73 of the 124 delegates of the state were black. So you're talking a black majority government in the seedbed of the Confederacy. I mean, how ironic. The reason why South Carolina was able to do this is because it had one of the largest enslaved populations of any state in the South at that point. In fact, black people were a numerical majority of the state, so they had the voting power. So for all young people who think that votes don't matter, there's also another historical precedent in which they did. If people go out and vote, they vote for their values and what they want, they elect people they trust. These are the types of policies that can be implemented. For a group of people in which the vote had been withheld for multiple generations, they knew the importance of casting the ballot. So they did. They did so in droves. So much so that they elected one of the most radical state governments that the country has ever known. So South Carolina becomes a unique case study because its demographics were particularly unique, and given that it had one of the most violent histories in the U.S. South at that point. Now, the period between 1868 and 1877 is largely known as the period of radical or Reconstruction. Anything in about 1870s or so is largely considered the radical Reconstruction, because they weren't just Republicans, they were radical Republicans, and they were individuals who were tired of the status quo and they wanted to make a significant change. They did a lot of different things, but one thing that made them very distinct was this idea of universal education. And if you ask me, it makes complete sense as to why this might be a top concern for many of If you have a government body largely of African descent, not far removed from the experience of enslavement, knowing what it's like to even have literacy withheld from you, the only way you think that the state is going to work with a largely illiterate, newly freed, formerly enslaved population, and a large percentage of poor white people who also couldn't read. How are you going to elevate that state's population? You did so in opening education to them, legitimately making schools, colleges, and universities of this state supported in whole or in part by the public funds that shall be free and open to all the children and youths of the state. And this is where they really distinguish themselves as far as writing it into their creed, without regard to race or color. Okay? As far as I know, the California Organic Charters Act did not put that language in. And this was largely because in the 1860s, I don't think California was perhaps had the same type of history as South Carolina. But in this context, you're talking about people who understood that race was kind of at the crux of the debate. So, after 1868, this is what will open the doors for individuals of African descent to actually gain an education. But it doesn't happen at the University of South Carolina until a few years later. But this is essentially the step forward. So you have educational reforms happening in the early 1870s, which will allow free integrated education for all classes and castes. So it's not even just about race, it's also about class as well. Free textbooks for poor children, and increased enrollments in public schools and more schools commissioned. So if you look at all of these things, there is a deep understanding that poverty is also a hindrance to an educated population. And so if you open up and allow some sort of equitable distribution of resources to even the poorest communities, the idea was that you could elevate that population to be productive members of society, that poverty did not have to be generational. So that this is incredibly forward thinking, even by the standards of today. This is considered incredibly radical by many in the public sphere. But let's rewind for a second to give you some context as to the university that we are dealing with here, because this was not a guarantee that black students would enroll. The origin of this particular institution was first called South Carolina College, formed in 1801. So it makes it actually one of the oldest institutions of higher learning in the country at this point. Those who largely attended the institution were the wealthy sons of slave owners. That was basically who did it. So you're talking about very privileged white males who were basically going there to get an education so they could inherit their father's plantation. So some might accuse it of being a symbolic thing as to whether or not they really needed it, but it was essentially an entry into manhood, and then it provided an education for those who could afford it. The other group that populated this particular school were enslaved people. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with African American history, enslaved people on college campuses was by no means an anomaly. And it wasn't even just a Southern thing. If you actually look at some of the initiatives that Harvard is taking and Princeton, a lot of schools, even in the very wealthy Northeast, are actually starting to apologize for their role in slavery and the expansion of enslavement as well. So part of what made a number of these very old private institutions wealthy were the enslaved laborers they didn't have to pay to help build the universities. So South Carolina College's presence of enslaved people was not an anomaly, but it does suggest that there were certain conceptions about race that existed on that campus before the entry of a student population in the 1870s. One of them was named Simon P. Smith. So he gives a testimonial in 1873. And this is actually a selection I took from a letter he wrote to a friend of his who was trying to recruit him to come to the University of South Carolina because he knew he was from South Carolina himself. So Smith responds, and he eventually rejects the offer, but this is what he says about the very notion that he, a former slave on the university, could attend there as a student. When quite a small boy, I used to wait on Southern students in that college. And I remember once standing in the door of one of the buildings, and I cried because I could not go to school. Now, thank God, there has been a great change. The mountains have been brought low, and the valleys are exalted. So he's using a popular biblical phrase toward the end of that sentence to say things seem like they have now literally inverted. Everything is completely changed. The valley's brought low, or the valley's exalted, and the mountains are brought low. And this reflection, I think, is particularly revealing because it suggests that enslaved people didn't simply just accept this position. Smith wanted to go to school. He was around people being educated. He understood what was happening, despite the fact that the popular perception of the day is that black people didn't have the intellectual capacity to keep up. So, Smith, who was when he wrote this letter, was being educated at Howard University, wrote the letter to essentially suggest that even though he won't be attending the university, he was very excited that others could, because it fulfills the dreams of many, many people like him. So, how is it desegregated? Essentially, one of the reasons why there was not a flood of student attendance after 1868 passed that law is because we're still talking about a population that's going to have a lot of trepidation about pushing the envelope too much. Social change doesn't immediately happen most of the time. It takes a significant amount of planning, a significant amount of strategizing, and then you have to wait for that right moment to actually happen. Because after 1868, when the Constitution was written, a lot of white commentators were very fearful that that's what was going to happen. So they were going to do everything they possibly could to intimidate the black population into not overstepping. They could vote with federal protection, but don't you dare try to integrate that university. That's the last thing that stands as the bastion of whiteness within the state. One journalist even said that if the university goes, this will be the first step toward what he calls Africanization of the state, in which the black people will take over the state and dominate the whites. That was one of the things that people feared, especially in a state like South Carolina, which did have a numerical black majority. However, as more politicians started to gain some type of clout, particularly black politicians, they started to get a bit more courage to actually make the first move. That first move happens in October 1873 with this individual named Henry E. Hayne. So most people don't know who Henry E. Hayne is, even in South Carolina, but you're talking about the person who desegregated a university in the 19th century. A lot of people know those who desegregated schools in the 1950s and the 1960s, but little do we know that there were people who actually entered white Southern institutions in the 19th century under a significant amount of danger. After he enrolled in 1873, property was destroyed, professors resigned because they knew that what this meant was that other students were soon to follow, and there was nothing they could legally do to prevent it. So Hayne took that first step and enrolled in the medical school, but what's fascinating is that according to the documents I've looked at, he never attended a class. He simply did it under the notion that he knew that as soon as he did it, others could then do it after. So Hayne was acting at this moment as Secretary of State of the state of South Carolina as well. So here you have a politician actually doing ground level activism. I mean, imagine that, not just asking for donations all the time, actually doing something. And basically encouraging other young people and older people that it was now their turn to go and get educated. Hayne himself was this was not his first rodeo, so to speak. He had a history of activism, and he even had a history of disrupting things. That was kind of one of the things that he liked to do There may have been some privilege involved as to why he did this, because as you can see from the photo, he's very light complected. He actually stems from a relatively prominent family of free people of color in the city of Charleston, South Carolina. So Hayne actually never knew slavery as far as an actual experience he had himself. He was born, as far as we can tell, a free man. And while some free people of color were apt to reject their African heritage, Hayne seems to have embraced it. And he seems to have done so with the notion that he could help others who did not have the advantages of being born into freedom. So he desegregates the university. And I started to try to find out the stories I could tell in regards to who attends the university. What does it look like? I mean, if there was a day-to-day catalog of what students did on the campus, is there any way to reconstruct that? So one of the first individuals I ran into, who is relatively better well-known, is Richard T. Greener. Now, Richard T. Greener is an interesting character in that he was also born free in the North, okay? He is the first African American to graduate from Harvard, okay? And he would be recruited by the superintendent of education in the state of South Carolina to come and teach mental and moral philosophy as a member of the faculty at the University of South Carolina. So not only did the university have black students, it also had a black faculty member. And I assume, though I don't have many documents proving this, but I do assume that the powers that be were cognizant that if you're going to educate a population of African descent, you should have somebody who understands them on some type of social or cultural level. So they recruited Greener because they thought it would be important for him, as a respected scholar of classics and whatnot, to go into a classroom and be able to relate to students on a level that others could not. Now, to discuss Greener's work ethic very briefly, I mean, I'm a professor over at California State University, Fullerton, and I couldn't imagine doing what he did while he was at the university. Not only did he teach classes, he guest lectured for other people that came onto campus that wanted to hear from him. He functioned for a time as the university's librarian because he found that the catalog was pretty much out of whack by the time he got there, so he actually was responsible at the time for organizing thousands, tens of thousands of books at that point, and he decided to get a law degree while he attended the University of South Carolina. So he was a faculty member, a guest lecturer, a librarian, and a law student all at the same time. Because here you can see also a man who values education on the deepest level. And this would actually pay off for him because the law degree he earns at the University of South Carolina allows him to transition after the university closes to black students to become Dean of Howard University's law school. So who knows if he wouldn't have obtained that law degree at the University of South Carolina if that's the position he would have obtained. So Richard T. Greener is relatively more well known among scholars of African American history, but not as much for what he did at the University of South Carolina. This moment in his life is often lost in a lot of popular histories that you might read about him, or it's very abbreviated. But this was, I would argue, a very significant component of even his own professional development, emerging from a student of Harvard University to a faculty member at a state institution.
What state is Howard located in?
It is in Washington, D.C. Yeah. So, and that was pretty common for a lot of black students to go to Howard, which is usually called the Mecca for most who attend historically black colleges and universities. So just to give you an idea of the stuff that I do as a historian, this is Richard T. Greener's original acceptance letter for the position at the University of South Carolina. And I found this when I was researching at the State Archives, the Department of Archives and History in South Carolina. And I always show it to people to kind of give an impression that Google searching makes people a little sour to the work that historians do. I wish I could have word searched Richard T. Greener's first letter, but this required mining many very old and dusty boxes to finally come across something of this caliber. So it's just an idea that I'm working with a lot of primary sources that I'm trying to piece into a narrative to tell this particular story. So you might ask, this was an integrated campus, more or less. It wasn't just black students attending. They became the majority population. But we're also talking about white students that also matriculated into the university. And if you're talking about kind of the hotbed of race relations at the time, the assumption many might come to is that how could this be possible that black students and white students are sharing the same space as equals, legally, as legal equals? Knowing that this was a question, and it was often something that the press was lambasting, suggesting that the university was a failure because it was going to start a race war, there's no way that this would work, the students actually started writing letters, op-eds, to the local newspapers explaining to them that this was actually working out really well, much to their surprise. So this individual, T. McCants Stewart, said the following in 1874, while the university was still open to black students. "I want it distinctly understood that the University of South Carolina is not in possession of any one race. The two races study together, visit each other's rooms, play ball together, and walk into the city together, without the blacks feeling honored or the whites disgraced." And so we can unpack that later on during the discussion that we have, but I just find it fascinating that he goes into so much detail about the social interactions between the two groups. He could have just said, everything's fine, nobody's fighting, we're all just studying, but he goes out of his way to say, yeah, we even go into the city together, it's a lot of fun here. I mean, imagine 19th century South Carolina seeing black and white students walking into downtown. I mean, it's almost unfathomable. But Stewart claims that this was his reality. This is something he experienced. And he was writing not as a reflection. There was no nostalgia. He was writing in real time in 1874. In 1875, another letter was released by a group of students, presumably multiracial, suggesting, quote, "It was prophesied that the admission of colored students would never be endured, that it would break up the university. But white and colored students are now pursuing their studies amicably together, and there is no war of races." So, students would constantly have to defend their position to a press that was very unkind to the whole idea that they were studying together. So, it's not entirely clear how old these individuals were, but it does suggest that student activism was happening far before what we call the civil rights movement in the 1950s and the 60s. Student activism goes all the way back to the 1870s in this case. But who were the students? What did they do? What did they accomplish? What did they achieve? Did this experience lead to anything? There's a lot of different examples I could use, but the best one that I usually come back to is an individual called William Henry Hurd. He wrote a pretty lengthy autobiography of his own life, listing his accomplishments, things that he went through. We know from that autobiography he was the son of a skilled slave. His father had a particular skill that allowed him to make some additional money usually, had a little bit of mobility going between plantation to plantation, but he lists that his mother was a breeder. Anybody familiar with that term? Breeder usually connotes the idea that her body was solely seen to reproduce children. And this was not uncommon. I wrote my dissertation on slave marriages, and I wrote a little bit about what were called breeding women. And essentially, Hurd's mom was only there to bear children for the slave owner, because the more children that she bore, the more money he would accumulate. Enslaved bodies were capital. So, here you have the son of a breeding woman, matriculating into a state university. But it is the detail that he provides that allows us to reconstruct how the system operated at the time. So, he says in that bottom paragraph, kind of like the main crux of the argument I'm making here. There were scholarships in each county, and any boy over 16 years of age and under 21 years could compete for these scholarships. Abbeville County, in which I lived, was entitled to 5. I won one of these scholarships, entered the university, and received $20 per month. With that, I supported my family and myself. So Hurd took advantage of the idea that he was not going to be charged tuition. His room and board would be taken care of by the university. He would live there for free, and he would actually get paid to study. And according to him, and the sum of $20 per month was not insignificant in the 19th century. I mean, it sounds like it would be, but it actually was a decent amount. So they were giving people realistically enough to live on, and if you're a former slave, you are used to having no money. So the fact that you're getting any money is significant to you, and you probably learn what you actually need versus what you want. So Hurd seems to have been able to live frugally enough to where he could send money back to his family that was struggling in the rural South. So the institution not only provided an education for a number of people, but it also provided a livelihood for those that qualified for a state scholarship. Now Hurd would have to leave the university after it closes to black students as the governmental change in 1877, but he would reflect on his time at the University of South Carolina as a significant shift, and he would use the educational attainments to accomplish other things. He eventually would become the state legislature in South Carolina for Abbeville County, in which he lived, and he would eventually be promoted, so to speak, as a diplomat to Liberia. So he was actually an international or transnational traveler. And the one reason why I think it's important to concentrate on William Hurd is you can't help but wonder what might have happened if they hadn't have closed the university. So when you talk about this practice of counterfactual history, what could have been, some people ask what would happen if the Confederacy would have won. I think the more important question is what would have happened if Reconstruction hadn't failed? What would it look like today in the United States of America? Would we be dealing with what we're dealing with now? Hurd is an example of a person that could have made significant contributions to both the university and the state, but it was made very clear to people like him that he was not welcome as an equal within this particular system. So why was it resegregated? Why did it fail, so to speak? Now, it's the usual answers. I have nothing particularly significant to add here, except for maybe that there is at least one thing that makes South Carolina particularly unique. Voter intimidation in local politics. The Klan tried some resurgences. The federal government tried to stamp them out. But what we largely see is that by the mid-1870s, it's becoming much harder for African American men to enact the vote, to go to ballots. They're being intimidated, shot, drug out of their houses, and told to not vote. So voting starts to go down significantly amongst the black population. And then one thing that is particularly nefarious is the presidential race of 1876, in which I believe Rutherford B. Hayes would be elected. The short explanation of what happened in this case is that there was basically a dead tie between the Republicans and the Democrats. They were recounting and recounting, but no one could decide who had actually won. So essentially, a deal is struck to where the Republicans say, if you give us the presidency, we will withdraw all federal troops from the southern states, which essentially means there will be no more people to police your activities down there. And basically the Democrats are looking at this saying, well, basically they get the presidency and we get everything else. So they took the deal, backdoor deal. I believe Rutherford B. Hayes is the Republican who is elected. And what we find is this voter intimidation becomes amplified. African Americans can no longer vote in the large numbers they could when they had federal protection. And you have the reestablishment of white supremacist governments. South Carolina is, I believe, one of the last ones to fall in 1877. So after 1877, the new governor enacts a policy that will disbar integrated institutions. He will overturn the 1868 Constitution in less than a decade. So this essentially means that African Americans can no longer attend predominantly white institutions or traditionally white institutions, and then you start to have a number of historically black colleges popping up in the state of South Carolina. So segregation is amplified after the fall of Reconstruction because white Southerners get a taste of what integration looks like to them, and a number of them don't like it, or at least they're convinced not to like it. But there's a certain irony here that when I found this, I almost leaped from my chair out of joy because I found it too delicious to overturn. There's a legacy of desegregation under Jim Crow that specifically relates to this example. In 1936, the University of South Carolina, at that point, thoroughly segregated university, only white people attended, white males attended mainly. And they had a tradition that every year at a graduation commencement, they would bestow a cane to the oldest living alumnus at the time. Now you gotta think, I think we're all old enough in this room to remember days before Google. You didn't know what people looked like sometimes. You just saw their name, you reached out to them, and when you saw them, that's when you finally understood who they were. This was no different. They found that there was an individual named the Reverend Mr. Townsend, who, according to the catalog of people who obtained degrees at South Carolina, was the oldest living alumnus. So they sent him a letter and said, congratulations, the oldest person who died the year before, you've been selected to receive the honorary cane for this particular ceremony. And he accepts. He's thrilled. Like, yeah, great. I mean, one thing you find is that despite the political problems that happened, a number of people who attended the institution had very fond memories of it. And so for a person of African descent to realize he's being honored for that, he's of course going to say yes. So he says yes, and right before the commencement, they discover that he's African American. And they're faced with this predicament. Do we rescind the offer? There's just no way we could possibly allow him to take the cane. So they make this very terrible excuse and letter saying he will not be considered for the award. Members of the Alumni Association, which raised funds for the cane, are all white, and contemplated that the award should, of course, go to one of the white alumni. Now, the interesting part of this, though, is that this was not a secret. People found out about it, especially the black press at the time. So one thing that I found as I was searching through a series of articles that were contemporaneous with this date is that the black press found this hilarious. And they pulled no punches in basically making fun of the University of South Carolina for making this particular mistake. So there was at least some poetic justice after the fall of Reconstruction, in that in 1936, they had to realize that they did have black alumni, despite the fact that it had become this white supremacist institution at the time. Okay, so the question is, okay, so what? This happened so long ago, why should we care? Now, just to draw your attention here, The University of South Carolina is starting to take some strides in commemorating this particular history. It was something a lot of people knew about, if you were from the area, but there was never a visible marker. There was nothing tangible that reminded you about this particularly compelling moment. So as of this year, I believe, they've put up a statue of Richard T. Greener right by the university's library. So that anybody that attends the institution and goes to the library is met with the gaze of Richard T. Greener reminding them to study. And it makes sense that he's next to the library, considering the fact that he saved the library while he was there. So, but if we talk about even more of a legacy in the political moment we are currently engaged in, I lifted this quote from a master's thesis that I found while I was researching this topic from a woman named Pamela Mercedes White, who wrote her thesis in the 1970s. And she says the following thing about this institution. If the first duty of any educational institution is to its students, the Radical University was a success. Because in her findings and in her opinion, it was an institution that was deeply committed to the educational progression of those that attended it. Sometimes when we look at certain institutions across the United States, we look at kind of corporatism, who is really being served here. But at this point, it seems, from the consensus of both contemporary figures and historians, that if given a chance to succeed, this could have been a very compelling moment in changing how education is conceptualized in the United States. But it simply wasn't given a chance. It was open for maybe 3.5 years to black students at the time. Most of them didn't have a chance to complete their degrees. So, it also gives some reference point for those who are a bit perplexed on, how the economies of Northern Europe work. Bernie Sanders often talks about Scandinavian countries, Germany, as examples of places that have successfully implemented tuition-free institutions. But my argument is that the US already has examples that you can look at. What was happening here? How was it implemented? Why was it being implemented? And so I took a passage from an article I'm writing in the middle paragraph that I'll read because I don't think I could properly provide it from memory. It says, "The evidence lies within this country's history, especially among a group of people who deeply understood the value of accessible education as they emerged from slavery. It is high time the largely unknown innovators of free education in the United States are properly credited by American politicians and pundits." Despite the fact that African American history has been given some prominence, say, in the past 10 to 20 years, there is still so much out there that is known by a select few. It's just not known by enough people. This should not just be a local history. Okay? I mean, it's obviously a local history of the fact that it's one particular place. But I think that most people could look at the situation here and draw a number of parallels as to how people would at least entertain the idea of expanding education without people having to feel they have to go into massive amounts of debt to do so. The argument could be is that, well, what we're doing now arguably is causing a significant amount of problems. Perhaps we could look into other venues as well. So with that, I will open it up to any interesting thoughts or comments. Thank you very much.